Interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hi, and welcome back to the channel. I'm joined today by Professor Victoria Bourne, Dr. Vanita Chamdal, and also Gemma, who are going to be talking to me today about imposter syndrome. Thanks for joining me, guys. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Excellent. So imposter syndrome, I think perhaps maybe some of our viewers are already familiar with this. It's somewhat of a kind of household concept, but nonetheless, just in case some of our viewers aren't really sure what imposter syndrome is, maybe one of you can kind of give us a bit of an overview to what we mean by this exactly. So Vanita, do you have a particular sort of definition that you might be able to give to our viewers about what imposter syndrome means?
Yeah, I mean, the word definition is quite heavily weighted because there isn't necessarily a gold standard definition, but it's generally the feelings that your achievements are kind of through luck rather than merit. And there's kind of constant feeling and thinking that there's a chance that you're going to get found out. So it's kind of definitely existing through kind of internal pervasive beliefs that kind of formulate through like a negative belief system. But then the original kind of conceptualization was in the 70s by clinical psychologists. And it was described as kind of the feeling of intellectual phoniness that was kind of prevalent amongst, and this is quite interesting, amongst high achieving women. So there was this kind of an acknowledgement, I guess, of the gender element. But I think as research has gone on, it's acknowledged as well that, or research has acknowledged that it's not just to one specific gender. It's across kind of many demographics.
Yeah, and we'll sort of talk a little bit later about who sort of experiences this more than others, but certainly, from my personal kind of experiences, when you were kind of outlining this idea of imposter syndrome, I can think of a few times in my life where certainly felt like an imposter. Sometimes I expect the YouTube police to come knock on my door and wheel me away and sort of say, what are you doing? You're not a YouTuber. But maybe some of you guys can offer some of your own personal experiences of imposter syndrome. I'm sure it's quite a commonplace. I don't know, maybe Victoria, do you want to start first with any personal experiences around imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite amazing when you start talking about it, how many people do experience this feeling of, I just don't quite belong here, I don't quite deserve this, I'm not quite good enough. Somehow I've fluked my way through my entire career, and at some point someone's going to turn around and say, you have no idea what you're doing, do you? And you're going to go, oh, they've worked it out finally. And then everything's just going to fall to pieces, which is possibly a slightly more dramatic version of imposter syndrome. But I think when you start talking to people, it's amazing sort of how often that does happen. And I think, I do definitely get those feelings sometimes. And like Vanita was saying, it tends to be more women. But also, I was the first generation in my family to go to university. And I definitely have moments right the way through my career, and still have them, where I'll be in a university setting and I just don't sometimes feel like I quite belong there. It's not my place. And I think, growing up in a family that never went to university, my parents left school when they were 14, 15, it feels slightly at odds being in that university setting sometimes, even having worked in universities for more years than I want to say out loud. So I think it is definitely something that you can experience for a really long time for various reasons. But I think one of the best examples I've had of that kind of doubting myself, I teach statistics, right? I've always taught statistics. I teach statistics every year. And every single year for many, many years, I have taught about standard deviation, right? Really quite early on in the degree, relatively simple statistics. Every year I do it. I've also now written 2 statistics textbooks. In the first one, I went through the whole equation of how you do the standard deviation, everything. So I know, logically, I know this. But yet when I wrote my second stats textbook, I spent nearly a whole day double checking that I really understood what the standard deviation was and what the equation was, Googling furiously and looking through all these other stats textbooks just to make sure I hadn't got it wrong. And I spoke to somebody and I said, "Do you remember what I've done today?" And I said, "How, if you'd have got it wrong, somebody would have pointed it out by now. You cannot taught hundreds and hundreds of students and written a textbook and got it wrong and somebody would not pointed it out. But yet still, that was my worry. And I think that just kind of really shows how, even when you've done something loads, it's quite basic, it can be very easy to slip into that, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, and maybe this is the moment where everyone's going to realise that I have no idea what I'm talking about. But actually, we do. It's just very difficult to get your head around that sometimes, particularly if you're feeling a little bit worried or nervous about something. It's very easy to slip into that, I think.
I think many of our viewers right now are opening up your textbooks, checking your definitions of standard deviation. And when this gets released, you may get a few emails just querying your definition. Perhaps.
Right, won't tell me, because the consequences would be catastrophic.
Gemma, how about you? Have you had any kind of examples of when you felt like an imposter?
Oh, definitely. When I was thinking about this podcast, I was thinking, I used to get this quite often. Just to echo what Victoria said, I'm the first generation of my family to go to university. I'm a PhD student, the first person ever in our, even in wider family, to do a PhD. And when I started my PhD, I remember my first day sitting in the office and just thinking, I don't belong here. What am I even doing? I need to just go home, because, this is just, they are going to realise I'm not as clever as they think I am. And, I only got onto this by chance. I interviewed really well, just making excuses to why I had achieved to get onto the PhD programme, not actually thinking, I deserve to be here. That I didn't really show my capabilities. It was, I wasn't as good as everyone was making it out to be. And then actually, like Victoria said, when you end up talking to people more about it, everyone feels like this at some point, and you wouldn't be where you are. Chance doesn't happen that often,
Yeah. I mean, I remember back from when I started my PhD, I remember thinking very much like, did they give it to the wrong person? Because I was someone who kind of heavily tattooed, long hair at the time, loved rock music. And I was just like, I don't feel like I fit as the kind of stereotype or the prototype of what I kind of considered to be a PhD student. So I very much at the beginning felt like an imposter. And I think there's a kind of running theme going on here. I don't know, Vanita, if you've got an experience about imposter syndrome as well that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I'm just kind of echoing Gemma and Victoria in terms of first generation, and particularly doing PhD as well. Mine's slightly different, and I'm coming from kind of the South Asian perspective, where I got my first salaried job, and it was in a kind of a corporate organization. And I remember kind of sitting there very similar to Gemma, first day, looking around and thinking, I really shouldn't be here, and then kind of convincing myself that I'm there as the token, and that stuck with me, because it was that first kind of experience, that core belief state. And it was only until kind of when I started the PhD and then getting a job and so on, where I started working in universities and surrounding myself with people who weren't just white males, where I started to realize, oh wait, hold on, people can come from all sorts of backgrounds and be recognized for their merits and their knowledge and so on. And that's so witnessing that really challenged that core belief. And that's something that I was that stuck with me with every job then that I got. And it's something through witnessing other people and speaking to other people and seeing that that there are people out there that can be recognized for what they're able to achieve and what they're able to bring to the table. So slightly different perspective in that sense. And it's interesting because I think within the research, whilst it is quite limited, there is something about being communities as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that I noticed as well, that people from minority backgrounds, females as well, and there's other, obviously Victoria mentioned first generation students too, seems to be that there's a kind of running theme here. I mean, I'm not someone who does research around imposter syndrome, but based on kind of my research area, if I was to kind of try and imagine why these kind of feelings emerge, is it feels like there's a kind of mismatch between what we believe, so we'll hold kind of cultural beliefs about who we think does this, who we think does that. And then sometimes in life, for example, with some of our own experiences, we feel like we don't match what is the kind of prototype or still stereotype of who we think does those sorts of things. So for me, I didn't think it was a kind of person who had long hair and loved rock music who studied psychology and did research. And obviously in some other cases for you guys, it's been more around gender or ethnicity or first generation student, for example, that seems to have kind of produced that potential sort of disparity in your beliefs and where you find yourself personally in your life. But Vanita, I believe you actually are familiar with some explanations that have been put forward in the research area. So what kind of researchers who sort of do this kind of work, what are they kind of suggesting is the potential reason as to why these kind of feelings emerge?
It's an interesting one because I'm coming from kind of my clinical background of a therapist. So the research, as we've established, is quite limited. And coming from kind of the cognitive behavioral perspective, there is some research suggesting that these significant experiences of kind of having that initial thought process of I don't belong here, that kind of intellectual phony kind of feeling, it shapes kind of that core belief system, which is basically something that we experience and something that we shape very, very early on in life or during significant periods of our life later on. And that can filter through our thought process. So it starts to kind of impact how we think, and then how we think impacts kind of how we, our emotions, and then our actions, and that kind of turns into this cycle. But there are, of course, individual differences in how it's experienced as well. And what we've already kind of established as well is that there are some gender differences, particularly in coping. So in terms of the literature suggesting that women were more likely to experience imposter syndrome, that was kind of almost due to how it was originally conceptualized and understood and measured. However, as research then progressed, it established that actually men and women just cope with it differently. But also kind of pre-existing coping techniques, so kind of overcompensating by tapping into kind of perfectionist beliefs, or going completely on the other end of the spectrum of avoiding the situation completely through denial, can be certain ways of coping, which again taps into that cycle that I mentioned with the actions, thoughts and emotions.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about who sort of experiences these things. It seems to be that we've all had personal experiences, and I think maybe some of our viewers have had personal experiences too, but certainly it seems to be the case that some people experience it more often than others, and we seem to have sort of already pinpointed certain sort of potential features or examples that we can use. So gender seems to be something often in the literature that so women tend to experience it more often than men. And obviously, I think also, Vanita, you mentioned earlier that ethnicity also seems to be a factor. So people from minority ethnic backgrounds also tend to experience it more. I don't know if anyone is familiar with any other sort of research that suggests other sorts of antecedents or predictors of or feelings of imposter syndrome?
I think generally it's any of the underrepresented groups. So whether it's to do with women, whether it's to do with ethnicity, whether it's first generation, LGBT groups, any underrepresented group, I think it's when you're coming from that minority, you don't feel like you belong because the majority belong. And so I think that creates that kind of disparity in how you feel internally with how you perceive the world to be, and then there's that mismatch there, and I think that's very difficult to kind of get your head around. I think it's quite interesting what Vanita was just saying, because certainly from my experience, when you're in those situations, it does almost feel like a bit of a fight or flight type response. So if I'm asked to give a talk or to take on a particular role at work or something like that, where I have that moment of, am I really qualified to do this? Can I do this? Am I good enough? It's like that, right, I say no, and I fly away, or you fight and you take it on. And I think you can really see in lots of people that have imposter syndrome, that perfectionism. if I'm going to do this, I have to really, really prove that I'm worth it. And so therefore I am going to do it so much, and I am going to be as perfectionist as I can, because I have to really prove that I deserve this. And so therefore I'm going to go all out and really be perfectionist. And I think that sort of avoidance, procrastination versus perfectionism is a really interesting consequence of imposter syndrome. And then thinking about it in an HE context, and lots of the discussions that have been going on recently around underrepresented groups not getting into university, and really thinking about, well, how do you get people to not do the flight thing, but actually to apply to university, apply to PhD, and come and join us and be supported, rather than just kind of going at the beginning, I don't deserve this, I shouldn't be here, so therefore I'm not even going to consider it, I'm not even going to apply. And I think that's where having a better understanding of these mechanisms in the background can be really helpful, so that we can help people to get over that kind of flight response and actually get people to come where they deserve to be.
Yeah, and I was going to say that in a bit, that obviously some of these factors that we're sort of talking about, I could imagine is perhaps some of the reasons why we see attainment gaps. If we're seeing lots of people from marginalized and minority groups who come to our higher education setting, if they're experiencing these kind of feelings and riddled with sort of self-doubt and other sorts of things that can be kind of consequences of these feelings, it might very much limit their ability to just focus solely on their work and achieve to the best of their ability. So I think there's a lot of interest in, not only the predictors, but also the consequences of it. And for a higher education setting, certainly what you said is one of them. I've got a bit of a list here as to other research factors that have been sort of shown to be potentially sort of predictive of imposter syndrome. I don't know if anyone else has got any of these from their knowledge, but family expectations seems to be one of them. That probably links with the idea of sort of perfectionism. I think high family expectations seems to lead to it. Low self-esteem as well is linked with imposter syndrome, which sort of makes sense a little bit when going back to Vanita's definition earlier, where Vanita, you sort of talked about how the sort of definition of imposter syndrome is where you kind of externalize your sort of successes as attributed to luck. Well, sort of research, at least on how people react to sort of self-esteem threat, is low self-esteem individuals tend to internalize failure, but when they do well, they tend to externalize those sorts of outcomes as well. So it seems to sort of make sense. Is there any other factors that anyone wants to kind of throw into the kind of list in terms of what might be related to imposter syndrome?
Something that I read, there wasn't much about this, but I think going back to what Victoria was saying, any kind of someone from a minority group, or where you are the minority in that situation, but financial uncertainty and things like that, even if you're experiencing not in higher education but in like a corporate job, like Vanita was saying, if you're progressing and being a high achiever, the financial uncertainty that you experienced when you were younger, for example, means that you don't belong in that really high corporate environment.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's kind of a lot of factors that seem to be linked to it, and it certainly seems to be something which is reasonably commonplace. We've already talked a little bit about some of the potential consequences. Victoria, you mentioned earlier about in a higher education setting about sort of students coming in who may be feeling these sorts of ways and how it might impact on their degree. Is there any other kind of research out there that sort of has looked at the potential consequences or outcomes of sort of feelings of imposter syndrome? I don't know, Vanita, if in your kind of background and experience and familiarity with the research, if there's any kind of work about what can be potential sort of outcomes of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, there is a fair bit of research in terms of how, kind of what the outcomes are in that sense, because so tapping into what I mentioned earlier with that cycle, it kind of casts doubt to kind of an individual's ability to perceive their own abilities, so that self-doubt and self-efficacy. And it has been associated with kind of anxiety and maladaptive coping strategies as well. So what we've already established in terms of that perfectionism of over-preparing or going completely the other way and procrastinating. And it has been associated with increased levels of stress. And for individuals kind of at work and even in academia as well, having them kind of on the verge of job burnout, and leaving them feeling very, very exhausted. And it does seem to be associated with low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, where an individual may be particularly at risk, or it may lead them to, through maladaptive coping strategies, on that kind of trajectory almost.
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of finish off this discussion, because I'm aware of the time, let's assume that we've got some viewers that do have feelings of imposter syndrome, and maybe they're not quite sure how to sort of manage it, or how they can kind of try and alleviate those feelings. I don't know if there's any, maybe it's research that you're familiar with sort of actual suggestions from clinicians about how to sort of manage these sorts of thoughts, but maybe from your own experience as well. How have you, or what kind of strategies have you found to be quite effective in managing these feelings? So maybe if we can just go around and talk very briefly about what has been effective for you, or something from the literature that you're familiar with. Gemma, why don't we start with you? What's been kind of a good tactic for you to manage these sort of feelings?
Yeah, definitely. I think anecdotally and from research as well, I saw that like talking to like in a group, or group interventions, group therapy, or even just for me, speaking to other people, the PhD students, really helped me with my feelings of imposter syndrome. I think with imposter syndrome, it's quite common to think that you're the only one with these feelings of self-doubt, and that you aren't supposed to be there. But actually, when you're in a group setting and everyone's kind of sharing their experiences, it can kind of help alleviate and think, oh, okay, it's kind of normal to have this anxiety to do with this new thing that I'm trying to do. And then, yeah.
So hopefully, almost in what you're saying is, just by listening to this podcast alone, it may be hopefully helpful for some of those people who are feeling this way. Victoria, what about you? Any kind of tips and strategies of what's been useful for you?
I think definitely, like Jim said, speaking to people is so important. And when I was sort of reading through some of the research and literature on this, one of the things I found really interesting was in that cycle, there's an element of shame. If I'm found out, I would be so ashamed. And I think shame is such strong and such a visceral emotion, you'll do anything to avoid it. So people don't talk about it, because by admitting to having it, you've kind of got to admit to that vulnerability and those feelings, and there's always that risk of that shame outcome. So I think it's a really difficult thing to talk about, but a really important thing to talk about. Because I think a lot of people experience it, and a lot of people, even if they don't have it big time, they'll probably have moments where they have had those kinds of feelings. I think one of the things that I find really helpful is if you've got a friend who kind of works in a similar environment, or is in that kind of situation as you, when you're doing things, because one of the big areas of research is around kind of applying for jobs and interviews and promotions and that kind of thing. If you're doing one of those things where you have to sort of write about how wonderful you are, I'm fantastic, so you should give me this job, you should give me this promotion, you should give me this award, you should give me this fellowship, whatever it is, those things where you have to turn around and say, this is what I've done and I'm good, it's really difficult when inside you're going, I don't think I deserve this, I don't think I belong. Imagining that you're your friend writing about you can actually be really helpful, because it allows you to take that step out and to be a little bit more subjective in how you view yourself. I think as soon as you're writing about you, it's so difficult to kind of sell yourself. Whereas if I imagine I'm my friend writing about me, it's a bit easier to pick myself up. So taking yourself out of it almost can be helpful. So when you're doing any kind of applications or anything sort of written, or you're doing a presentation or something, try to take yourself a little bit out and imagine being your best friend who's quite happy to say, you're awesome and amazing, just go for it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good tip. I often find it's really difficult for me to write about myself in sort of positive ways. It's much easier for me to just write a long list of negatives, but I think certainly your tips will be quite useful for me. Vanita, just to finish with you, what's your sort of strategy or suggestion as to how to sort of manage these sorts of feelings?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the literature, just echoing what Gemma and Victoria have said in terms of just speaking openly and essentially normalising how you're feeling, because that cycle that I spoke about earlier gets kind of reinforced through feeling alone, and it just kind of the cycle just increases at speed considerably. So just kind of being able to step out of that by speaking to others, by normalising how you're feeling, can be really helpful. And kind of coming from a clinical perspective, there's loads of worksheets that are available that are kind of cognitive behavioral processing styles. So you're essentially challenging yourself on what that belief is. And a really good one is ABC. So A is the activating event, so acknowledging what that event was that triggered that feeling. Understanding, so B is the belief system, so understanding that stop point and your response to that event. And so C is the consequence, and the consequence how that belief made you feel. And so this kind of noting it down and then challenging each of those points by asking yourself, well, where is a proof for this? And so being able to kind of really unpack it in that way can be particularly helpful for people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion to sort of finish on. So thank you for the three of you for sharing your experiences of imposter syndrome and some of the research that you're familiar with. We do have a bit of time left for it's a sort of loosely imposter syndrome sort of based quiz. So what I've done is I have, given that we've spoken a lot today about gender, and how females tend to experience imposter syndrome more, and particularly certainly in an academic setting, this has certainly been true for the three of you. What I decided was I found a paper which is, let me just bring it up. It's the 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century. It's by Hag, Bloom et al. From 2002. And what I thought we'd do is we'd shine the light a little bit on some of the female psychologists who made the top 100 list. Before we actually get into guessing who those are, and maybe you're familiar with some of them, do any of you want to just guess how many females made that top 100 list?
It's going to be depressingly low, isn't it?
Yeah, that was my thought. Is exactly.
Yeah, it is unfortunately depressingly low, given that it's from sort of 1900 to sort of 2000. Maybe in the next century, it might be slightly more representative, but certainly it seemed to be heavily dominated by not just males, but also white as well. Any guesses on a precise number of females?
10.
10. Gemma, what do you want to go with?
I'm going to be optimistic and say 15, but not that optimistic, clearly.
Okay, yeah, you should have all been less optimistic. 6 is the number, just 6. Some of them I personally was not familiar with who they were. So maybe you might not know some of them, but we can certainly talk a little bit about what they were sort of famous for. Some of them are perhaps reasonably quite famous, so you might be able to know some of these. So do you think you'll be able to guess the 6? How many do you think you'll be able to get? Who wants to kind of give a first guess as to a famous female psychologist from the 20th century?
I think Christina Maslach.
I have no idea who that is, and they are not on the list. What did...
That is, Christina Maslach is Zimbardo's partner who stopped him from being very
okay.
visible. And she went on to develop the burnout invention and kind of conceptualize burnout.
Well, I mean, that certainly is worthy of getting on the list in my book, but unfortunately it was not here. This was done based on certain metrics like impacts and citations. But certainly I think that's some very merit-worthy things to have achieved, but not on this list. Anyone want to take a different guess?
I was going to say Anna Freud.
Anna Freud?
Yeah.
Correct. So obviously familiar with psychoanalysis. She came in at 99th. So we've got 5 more to go. She was the lowest ranking female on the list. The others are all above her. We've got 5 more to get.
Elizabeth Loftus has to be on there.
Yes, Elizabeth Loftus was on the list. She's the highest ranking female as far as I could see, 58th, which is still depressingly low given...
so top 57 were all men?
Probably all white men, I think, yes. I mean, I don't actually have I kind of did a bit of Googling just to check if they were male or female sometimes. I might have missed a few out, but I think probably it was all white male above that, which is a very depressing statistic. For those of you who are not familiar with Elizabeth Loftus, she's a forensic psychologist, very famous for doing things like false memories, misinformation. Some of you may be familiar with the kind of car crash experiment where they changed the verb and people gave different estimates as to how fast the car was going. Can we get the other 4? There are
Uh,
at least 1 or 2 more here I think are certainly doable.
what about Mary Ainsworth?
Mary Ainsworth is on the list. She came 97th, and obviously Mary Ainsworth is famous for the strange situation. So we've got 3 more to get. You're doing quite well so far.
Anne Treisman.
Sorry?
Anne Treisman. She did memory.
No, not on the list as far as I can see.
Shocking.
There's 1 more here that I think you'll be familiar with. The other 2, I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with, but they're not my kind of area of expertise. So,
Oh, developmental.
yes, it's a very famous experiment. I think sort of year 1 psychology students would be familiar with this experiment.
I just can't get the name out.
What's the experiment?
If this was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you gave me the 4 names, I'd be able to do it.
Well, I don't have £1 million to give you, unfortunately.
You don't? Gutted.
No, but if anyone wants to sponsor this show for £1 million, we could probably get that sorted.
No,
Anyone else want to take a different guess?
I'm out.
Okay, so there were 3 that you didn't get, but I think Victoria does know one of them. I think she's sort of struggling to get the name out. So in 70th place, I'd never heard of this person before, Eleanor Maccabee, who was a developmental psychologist, apparently did a lot of research on gender and selective attention, but that's not my area of research. I wasn't certainly familiar with her. The one after this is the one I think Victoria was thinking of, is Eleanor Gibson, who came 75th, was also a developmental psychologist and was famous for, does anyone know Gibson as a name in developmental psychology? Famous experiment with babies, the visual cliff experiment.
Oh, of course.
And then very finally, in 89th place, is Margaret Washburn, who again, I wasn't familiar with, but a quick Google search told me she was apparently the first woman to get a PhD in psychology, which is an impressive feat.
Where did she rank?
She came 89th.
89.
Wow.
So ultimately, it's a sort of depressing look into sort of some of the issues around inequality in higher education and academia that we need to kind of address. And hopefully maybe in the next century's list, it will be slightly more representative. I'm just going to put my name out there and just say I'll take 99th place if any of those people in the year 2000 and sort of 100 are sort of putting it together. Just put me in there. 99th will do me fine. But certainly well done for those 6 individuals to get their name on the list and also get a bit of attention now to our viewers who are more familiar with the wonderful work that they did.
It makes me think that these 6 females must have really felt imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I would have imagined that they probably did if they were here to tell us their stories. Certainly, I would imagine for them, it probably certainly felt often a sense of feeling like an imposter in their settings. Okay, thank you all for joining me today and giving me your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!